You want to know what I'd do if my neighbor's son took my dog's life and his mother tried to burn my house down to silence me? The question isn't what I would do. The question is what I did, because this isn't a hypothetical. This is the story of how my little slice of heaven became a battlefield and how I had to fight a monster who lived right next door. I bought the house to start over. It was a small, charming place with a yard big enough for a garden and a dog, a quiet street that promised peace after a messy breakup and a soul-crushing job. For the first few hours, it was perfect. The sun streamed through the windows, the birds chirped, and I felt a sense of hope I hadn't felt in years. Then there was a knock. Knock, knock. It was a hard, impatient sound. I figured it was a neighbor wanting to introduce themselves, so I swung the door open with a smile. The smile died on my lips. Standing on my porch was a figure in a black ski mask, all dark clothing, his eyes hidden behind the menacing fabric. Before I could scream, he pushed past me into the foyer. A glint of steel caught the light. It was a knife, long and terrifyingly real, and he held it like he knew how to use it. My blood ran cold. This was it. My first day in my safe new home, and I was being robbed. He didn't say a word, just gestured with the knife toward my living room. I stumbled backward, hands held up in surrender, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He followed, and from a pocket, he pulled out a coil of rope. He forced me to turn around, and with rough practice movements, he tied my hands tightly behind my back. I could feel the coarse rope digging into my skin, the finality of it sending a fresh wave of terror through me. I was completely helpless. Only then, when I was bound and trembling, did he reach up and pull the mask off. And he laughed. It was a loud, braying laugh that echoed in the quiet house. He was young, maybe early 20s, with a smug, cruel face I instantly recognized. He was the boy I'd seen mowing the lawn next door when I first viewed the property. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he sneered, his eyes dancing with a sick kind of amusement. "Just a little welcome prank. You should have seen your face." He untied me, still chuckling to himself as if he'd just told the world's funniest joke. I stood there, rubbing my raw wrists, my mind reeling in a mix of fury and disbelief. This wasn't a prank, it was a threat. It was a declaration. And I, the stupid, hopeful newcomer, had just met my neighbor, Jeremy. I should have called the police right then. I should have packed my bags and run. But I was so desperate for this new start, so desperate for peace, that I convinced myself he was just an idiot kid with a twisted sense of humor. I told myself it was a one-off, a terrible, horrible, no good first impression that would fade away. I was wrong. It wasn't a one-off, it was an opening statement. In the weeks that followed, living next to Jeremy was like living with a poltergeist, but one you could see, and one that actively hated you. I spent a whole weekend planting a beautiful garden in my front yard, roses, lavender, daisies. The next morning, I woke up to a scene of total destruction. Every single flower had been ripped from the ground, their stems snapped, their petals crushed into the dirt. I knew it was him. When I confronted him, he was leaning on his porch railing, sipping a soda. "They were too pretty," he said with a shrug, not a hint of remorse in his voice. Made the rest of the street look bad. I was furious. I read him the riot act, telling him he was a destructive little punk and that he'd be paying for the damage. He just smirked that same infuriating smirk from the day of the prank. The next day, I found the price of my outburst. A long, jagged gash ran the entire length of my car door, a silver wound carved deep into the black paint. Screech. The sound my own fingernail made tracing it was almost as sickening as the act itself. He had keyed my car. There was no proof, of course, just his smug face watching me from his window as I discovered it. The scariest part wasn't even the property damage. It was the violation of my space, of my home. One afternoon, I was taking a bath, trying to soak away the stress of it all. The windows were open to let in the breeze. Suddenly, I heard a faint scraping sound against the side of the house. Scrape. Thump. I froze, straining my ears. Then, a shadow fell across the bathroom doorway. I looked up, and my heart stopped. Jeremy was standing there, having climbed a ladder to my second-story window and let himself in. He wasn't holding a weapon, he was just looking, snooping. His eyes scanned my belongings with a creepy curiosity. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound. He just grinned, gave me a little wave, and casually walked out, climbing back down the ladder as if he'd just come over to borrow a cup of sugar. The police were, to put it mildly, unhelpful. "It's your word against his," the officer said with a sigh after I reported the window incident. "He says he thought he heard someone crying for help and was checking on you. Without witnesses or camera footage, there's not much we can do." I felt a familiar wave of helplessness wash over me. I was alone in this. In the midst of this escalating nightmare, there was one source of light in my life: Max. He was a 5-month-old Jack Russell Terrier, a little whirlwind of white and brown fur with floppy ears and more energy than a nuclear reactor. He was my furry shadow, my constant companion, my reason for smiling. After the horror of the window incident, holding his warm, wiggling body was the only thing that made me feel safe in my own home. He was family. And then there was Linda, Jeremy's mother. I saw her occasionally, a woman with a forced, brittle smile and perfectly styled hair. She'd wave from her porch or offer a polite hello. if we passed on the street. She seemed so normal, so disconnected from the chaos her son was creating. I tried to convince myself she was just oblivious, that she had no idea her precious boy was a budding sociopath. It was easier to believe that than to accept the alternative. The day it all shattered started like any other. I was walking Max in the front yard, throwing his favorite squeaky toy. He was bounding through the grass, a picture of pure, unadulterated joy. That's when Jeremy came storming out of his house. I don't know what had set him off that day, but his face was a thundercloud of rage. He stomped right up to me, his eyes blazing. "You think you can just live here and—" He never finished the sentence. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard. Gasp! The sudden aggression shocked me. But before I could even react, Max did. My little 5-month-old protector, seeing his person being threatened, did the only thing he knew how. He lunged and bit Jeremy squarely on the ankle. It wasn't a vicious attack, more of a panicked snap. But it was enough. Jeremy howled, more in outrage than in pain. He looked down at Max, and the look on his face changed from anger to something dark and venomous. He drew his leg back and kicked. The first swing missed as Max scrambled away. But Jeremy wouldn't stop. He kept swinging his foot wildly, a vicious, relentless assault, until his steel-toed boot connected with my puppy's face. Crack. The sound was sickening, followed by a high-pitched yelp of pure agony from Max. "Stop it!" I screamed, shoving him away from my dog. "What is wrong with you?" Max was whimpering on the ground, blood starting to trickle from his tiny nose. I scooped him into my arms, cradling him, checking him over, my whole body shaking with a fury I'd never felt before. I verbally tore Jeremy a new one, screaming every curse word I knew. He just stood there, looking down at me and my injured puppy with utter contempt. He didn't apologize. He didn't show an ounce of regret. Instead, he just turned and walked away, calling back over his shoulder, "You better say goodbye to that little piece of crap." I didn't know it then, but it wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. And it was one he intended to keep that very night. I spent the rest of that day in a haze of fear and fury. I cleaned the blood from Max's nose, my hands trembling so hard I could barely hold the cloth. He was subdued, whimpering softly, and stayed glued to my side, a tiny, traumatized shadow. I called the vet, who assured me that as long as he was eating and drinking, he was likely just bruised and shaken. I held on to that sliver of hope like a life raft. I convinced myself the worst was over. I locked the doors, drew the blinds, and spent the night with Max curled up in my bed, his small body a warm weight against my leg. For a few hours, I tricked myself into believing we were safe. I woke to silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, empty silence that felt wrong. The first thing I noticed was the missing warmth against my leg. I sat up, my heart starting a low, anxious drumbeat. "Max?" I called out, my voice raspy with sleep. I looked around the room, then checked the hallway. Nothing. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, began to crawl up my throat. I told myself he'd just gone downstairs for a drink, that he was fine. But I knew. Deep in my gut, I knew. I raced downstairs, flipping on lights as I went, my calls becoming more frantic. "Max! Come on, boy! Where are you?" The house was empty. The back door, the one I was sure I had locked, was slightly ajar, a sliver of pre-dawn gray visible through the crack. "Number." "No, no, no!" I threw the door open and stepped into the chilling morning air of my backyard. And that's when I saw him. He was lying in the middle of the lawn, a small, still shape in the damp grass. He was covered in his own red, a dark stain that seemed to swallow him whole. He wasn't breathing. A massive, unnatural wound gaped in his abdomen. That night, as I stood there staring at Max's lifeless body, the tears I had been holding back broke free. I screamed into the night, a raw, gut-wrenching sound full of pain and rage. This wasn't just a senseless act of cruelty. It was an execution. Jeremy had killed Max because he could, because he knew it would destroy me, and his mother would probably excuse it like she had with everything else. My hands were still shaking when the police arrived, long after my scream had faded into sobs. I tried to explain, my voice cracking, pointing toward Jeremy's house, recounting his threat from the afternoon before. He said to say goodbye. He did this. The officers listened with a practiced patience that felt more like indifference. They took a few notes on a little pad, their flashlight sweeping over Max's body with a detached, clinical air. They didn't see my family, they saw a dead animal. Just as I feared, they seemed utterly disinterested in doing anything without hard proof. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset," one of them said, his tone flat. "But without a witness or a confession, our hands are tied. There's no physical evidence linking your neighbor to this." They filed a report, promised to look into it, but I could tell from their tone that they considered this a non-issue, a neighborhood dispute that had unfortunately involved a pet. They left me standing in my backyard with my dead dog and a hollow piece of paper that meant nothing. I was devastated. Max wasn't just a pet, he was my companion, and Jeremy had ripped him from my life without a single consequence. In the days that followed, the suffocating grief was made worse by Jeremy's constant, silent taunts. I could barely step outside without seeing him standing on his porch, staring at me with that smug, menacing grin. He knew the police weren't going to do anything, and now he was emboldened. Every glance, every smirk felt like a dagger, a reminder that he could do whatever he wanted and I was powerless to stop him. I I tried to keep to myself, hoping that if I ignored him, he might lose interest. He didn't. One evening, I came home from work to find my garden destroyed again. The flowers I had painstakingly replanted were ripped from the ground, their stems broken and scattered across the lawn like casualties of a forgotten war. My blood boiled, but what could I do? No one would listen. A few days later, Linda showed up at my door. I hadn't seen her since Max died, and a foolish part of me had hoped she was ashamed of her son's behavior. But as soon as I saw her standing there with that familiar, forced smile plastered on her face, I knew better. I just wanted to stop by and clear the air, she said, her voice dripping with a false concern that made my skin crawl. I know Jeremy can be a bit rough around the edges, but he's not a bad boy. He just gets carried away sometimes. Carried away? The words echoed in my skull. My dog was dead. My garden was a ruin. My car had been vandalized. But to her, it was just Jeremy being Jeremy. I'm so sorry about what happened to Max, she continued, her apology so flimsy it was an insult. But you know how animals can get. You really shouldn't leave them unsupervised. I stared at her, my mouth hanging open in disbelief. She was blaming me. In her twisted, deluded mind, this was somehow my fault. The rage that had been simmering inside me for days finally erupted, but it came out cold and hard, not hot. Your son unalived my dog, I said, my voice steady and low, each word a block of ice. And if you don't do something about him, it's only going to get worse. Linda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in her perfect facade, but she quickly regained her composure. Now, let's not be dramatic. Jeremy would never intentionally hurt an animal. He just has a temper, you know? He's a good boy at heart. I think you two just got off on the wrong foot. Wrong foot? I wanted to scream, to shake her, to make her see the monster she had raised. Instead, I did the only thing I had the energy for. Slam! I slammed the door in her face, the sound echoing the final, brutal closing of any hope for civility or reason. The battle lines had been drawn. It was me against them, and I was terrifyingly alone. The week after I slammed the door on Linda was a living hell. Jeremy's presence loomed over me even when I couldn't see him. I felt trapped in my own home, constantly on edge, waiting for the next attack. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was being hunted. And then, he escalated. It was late one night when I heard footsteps on my front porch, slow and deliberate. Thump, 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 thump. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I crept toward the window, peeking through the blinds. Jeremy was standing there, his face illuminated by the porch light, staring at my front door. For a moment, I thought he was going to break in again. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small envelope, and slid it under the door. I didn't move until I heard his footsteps fade into the night. Only then did I gather the courage to open the door and retrieve the envelope. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and my stomach turned to ice as I read the 5 typed words, "Say goodbye to your house." This wasn't a prank. This wasn't vandalism. This was a direct, calculated threat. Something had to change. I decided right then that I was done being a victim. If the police wouldn't build a case, I would build one for them. I went out the next day and bought security cameras, placing them strategically around my property. I started a detailed journal documenting every smug look, every lingering car, every single interaction. I was building an arsenal of truth. A few days later, I woke up to find my car's tires slashed. All 4 of them, the sound of my investment bleeding out onto the asphalt. The cameras didn't catch his face. He was smart enough to wear a hoodie, but the footage showed a figure of his build doing the deed. I knew it was him. I could see him smirking at me from across the street as I called the tow truck. Linda, of course, said nothing. She continued to wave at me as if her son wasn't systematically trying to ruin my life. About a month after Max's death, the harassment reached its boiling point. I was in the kitchen making dinner when a deafening crash exploded from the backyard. Crash. I rushed outside, my heart pounding, to find my sliding glass door shattered, shards scattered across the deck like jagged ice. Lying in the middle of the mess was a brick. Attached to it with duct tape was another note. Next time, it'll be you. Felt sick. This was no longer about my property. This was a threat against my life. I called the police again, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. This time, they took it seriously. An officer arrived within minutes, taking photos of the damage and the note. I showed him the security footage, which had captured the hooded figure running away. It wasn't clear enough for a positive ID, but it was something. The officer promised to have a patrol car keep an eye on the house for the next few nights. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Jeremy seemed to have backed off, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a dangerous glimmer of hope. Maybe the police presence had finally scared him. Maybe he'd finally gotten bored. But then, one evening, I was walking home from the store when I smelled it. Smoke. A thick, acrid smell that clawed at the back of my throat. My heart stopped. I dropped my grocery bags and ran, praying I was wrong. As I rounded the corner of my house, I saw the flames. My shed was on fire. Orange and red tongues of fire licked at the sky, devouring the small structure with a hungry roar. Whoosh! I screamed, fumbling for the garden hose, my hands shaking too much to work the nozzle properly. By the time I managed to douse the flames, it was too late. The shed was a smoldering blackened heap of charred wood. Everything inside, tools, lawn equipment, a box of old photos I hadn't unpacked yet was gone. I stood there, staring at the destruction, shaking not with fear, but with pure, unadulterated rage. This was it. This was the final straw. He had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The next morning, I took my arsenal, the letters, the USB drive with the security footage, the detailed journal, and went back to the police station. I refused to leave until a detective would see me. I sat in the waiting area for what felt like an eternity before a tired-looking detective finally agreed to meet with me. I laid everything out on his desk, my voice cold and steady as I explained the entire timeline, from the armed robbery prank to the ashes in my backyard. The detective listened carefully, taking notes. When I showed him the footage of the figure running from my yard after the brick was thrown, he paused, leaning in closer. "We might be able to get something from this," he said, a flicker of interest in his eyes. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. The police investigation moved forward. They interviewed Jeremy, who of course denied everything. Linda, as expected, backed him up, insisting her son was a sweet boy who was being unfairly targeted. But the evidence was piling up. The pattern of harassment, the letters, the footage, it was enough to paint a very clear picture. Then, one evening, I got a call from the detective. "We got him," he said. I felt a wave of relief so powerful I had to sit down. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," the detective continued, his voice grim. "We didn't arrest him for the fire or the threats or even the vandalism." I was confused. "Then what for?" He paused. "We caught him red-handed trying to break into another neighbor's house down the street. It seems he's been responsible for a string of break-ins in the area." I was shocked. I had known Jeremy was dangerous, but I hadn't realized the full extent of his crimes. He hadn't just been terrorizing me, he had been terrorizing the entire community. The detective continued. "When we searched his phone, we found things. He had photos of your house, taken at different times of day, notes on your routine. It looks like the fire was just the beginning. He was planning to break into your house next." A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air ran down my spine. I hadn't just been harassed, I had been stalked, I had been targeted, and I had been terrifyingly close to being his next victim in a much more personal way. The day of the trial arrived, and I felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. As I sat in the courtroom, I felt the weight of everything I had endured, the anxiety, the fear, the helplessness. It had all led to this moment. Jeremy sat across the room, his expression blank and detached. He looked less like a monster and more like a bored teenager in detention. Linda sat behind him, her face twisted in a permanent scowl, glaring at me as if I were the one who had done something wrong. When the prosecution presented the evidence me footage, the threatening letters, the testimony from other neighbors he terrorized, I felt a small, grim sense of satisfaction. It was all out in the open now. There was no hiding. In the end, the jury found Jeremy guilty on multiple charges. The judge sentenced him to several years in prison. Boom. The sound of the gavel felt like the closing of a tomb. As I heard the verdict, a wave of pure relief washed over me. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. As I walked out of the courtroom, I could feel Linda's hateful eyes on my back, but for the first time, I didn't care. I had won. Over the next few months, life slowly began to stitch itself back together. I replanted my garden, bigger and more beautiful than before. I had a new sliding glass door installed. I even thought about getting another dog, though the memory of Max was still a tender ache in my heart. The scars Jeremy had left, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal, but with him gone, I could finally breathe. I rarely saw Linda anymore. She kept to herself, a ghost in the house next door. Eventually, I heard through the grapevine that she had sold the house and moved away, unable to face the neighborhood her son had terrorized and she had enabled. My house no longer felt like a place of fear. It had taken a war I never wanted to fight, but I had reclaimed my space, my peace, and my life. So, back to the original question. What would you do if your neighbor's son took your dog's life and his mother tried to burn your house down? I hope you never have to find out. But if you do, I hope you fight. Trust your gut. Document everything. Be relentless. Because sometimes you are the only one who can deliver your own justice. What do you think? Could I have done anything differently? Let me know in the comments below.